May 5th, 1945, 4:47 a.m. The cold bit deep. Captain John Jack Lee could see his breath in the pre-dawn darkness, white plumes that hung in the air for a moment before dissolving into the Austrian night. He sat cross-legged in the open turret of his Sherman tank, besotting Jenny, and the metal beneath him was ice against his legs, even through his uniform. The name had been painted on the hull by one of his African-American soldiers, a bitter christening after a cheating girlfriend back home. Now, in the absolute stillness before dawn, the words seemed like a prophecy. The air tasted of diesel and dew, of gun oil and alpine pine, of something else, something metallic and sharp that Lee had learned to recognize over 5 months of fighting, the smell of violence waiting to happen. Below him, the castle courtyard was a pool of shadow. Stone walls 7 centuries old caught the last of the starlight. Somewhere inside those walls, former French prime ministers were checking the magazines of German submachine guns with shaking hands. Men who had commanded nations now crouched in medieval hallways, waiting for an enemy that wanted them dead. Beside Lee's tank, Wehrmacht soldiers he'd been trying to kill 2 days ago, whispered to each other in German as they positioned their machine guns. The Tyrolean Alps rose around them like the walls of a cathedral, dark, silent, indifferent to the tiny human drama about to unfold at their feet. Adolf Hitler had been dead for 5 days. The war was over. Everyone knew it. But the forest knew something else. Lee's gunner, Corporal Edward Simsick, a quiet kid from New York who'd never said more than 3 words at a time, suddenly tensed beside him. Lee followed his gaze to the tree line, 200 yards distant. Nothing. Just darkness. Just the whisper of wind through pine branches. And then Lee heard it. Metal on metal. The sound of rifle bolts being pulled back. Slow, deliberate. The mechanical heartbeat of men preparing to kill. The crunch of boots on frost-hardened earth. The soft clink of equipment. Canteen. Ammunition belts. The distinctive rattle of Panzerfaust tubes. And beneath it all, a sound that made Lee's stomach turn. The grinding squeal of iron wheels on stone. Heavy, methodical. The sound of an 88mm anti-tank gun being wheeled into position. The mist was beginning to lift from the valley floor, and through it, like ghosts materializing from the realm of the dead, they came. 150 Waffen-SS troops, black uniforms emerging from the gray dawn. Their faces were young, fanatical, empty of everything except purpose. Their orders were simple. Kill everyone inside the castle. Leave no witnesses. Leave no survivors. Erase this place from history. Lee's hand found the stock of his Thompson submachine gun. His knuckles were white. Behind him, inside 700-year-old walls, an impossible alliance had formed. An American tank commander who'd fought his way across France. A German major who'd betrayed his oath to protect civilians from his own countrymen, a 46-year-old tennis champion, and the men who would decide the future of France. They had spent 1 night preparing these defenses. They had until dawn to live. The eastern sky was beginning to glow, pale, weak, the kind of light that makes everything look fragile. And this is the story of the only battle in World War II where Americans and Germans fought side by side. It happened when the war was already over. It happened in the last moments before sunrise. It happened when there was nothing left to fight for except the idea that some lives are worth saving, even if it costs you your own. Castle Itter sits on a hill above the Austrian village of Itter in the Tyrolean Alps. In 1943, Heinrich Himmler ordered the castle seized and transformed into a prison for high-profile French prisoners valuable to the Reich. This wasn't Auschwitz. This wasn't Dachau, though Dachau administrators ran it. This was a gilded cage for France's elite. Inside, tennis player Jean Borotra, former prime ministers Édouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, former commanders-in-chief Maxime Weygand and Maurice Gamelin, Charles de Gaulle's elder sister, Marie-Agnès, and trade union leader Léon Jouot. These weren't just prisoners. These were the architects of modern France, the men who had declared war on Hitler, the generals who had commanded armies, the politicians who would rebuild their nation after the ruins. And Heinrich Himmler wanted them dead. By May 1945, the Reich was collapsing. Adolf Hitler committed suicide on April 30th. Soviet forces crushed Berlin. American tanks rolled through Bavaria. The SS guards at Castle Itter knew the end was near. On May 4th, they fled. The prisoners took control of the castle and armed themselves with the weapons that remained. However, they feared an attack by any roaming parties of SS men still loyal to the Nazi regime. They were right to be afraid. Elements of the 17th Waffen-SS Panzer Grenadier Division had been ordered to descend on the nearby castle and execute all prisoners who remained there. The clock was ticking, and the forest was full of killers. The bicycle. On May 3rd, Zvonimir Kuchkovic, an imprisoned Yugoslav communist resistance member from Croatia who worked as a handyman at the prison, left the castle under the pretext of performing an errand. He had one mission: find the Americans. He pressed on up the Inn River Valley towards Innsbruck, 64 kilometers distant, 40 miles, on foot, through territory crawling with SS troops who would shoot him on sight. He never returned. The prisoners didn't know if he'd been captured, or killed, or if help was coming at all. They waited. They feared. And then they sent another man. The cook. Andreas Krobot was a Czech cook, not a soldier, not a hero, just a man who knew how to pedal a bicycle. On May 4th, prison leaders accepted the offer of its Czech cook to bicycle to Vorgl midday in hopes of reaching help there, 8 kilometers down the mountain. The town of Vorgl was occupied, but by whom? Wehrmacht? SS? Austrian resistance? Krobot didn't know. He pedaled anyway. When he arrived, he was nearly caught by a patrol, but being pulled into a nearby house saved his life. His savior was a German officer. The defector. Josef Gangl was born September 12, 1910, in Bavaria, the son of a railway official. He was a career soldier in the Wehrmacht since 1935. From the war's beginning to Stalingrad, Normandy, and Bastogne, Gangl had seen everything, and it had broken something inside him. He had become disillusioned with Nazi ideology and defied recent orders to rejoin the SS, deciding instead to spend the final days of the war helping those who wished to resist them. According to an order from Heinrich Himmler, all male residents of houses displaying white flags were to be shot. Gangl positioned his 10 to 20 loyal Wehrmacht soldiers in Vorgl to protect civilians from SS reprisals. When Krobot told him about Castle Itter, Gangl knew he didn't have enough men. He needed the Americans. The meeting. Gangl's hopes were pinned on the Americans reaching Vorgl promptly so he could surrender to them. Instead, he would now have to approach them under a white flag to ask for their help. On the morning of May 4th, 1945, First Lieutenant John C. Jack Lee, Jr. sat cross-legged atop the turret of his M4 Sherman tank, comparing the Austrian countryside before him with the map that lay on his lap. For the last 5 months, Lee, a stocky 27-year-old from Norwich, New York, had led Company B of the 23rd Tank Battalion on a headlong advance across France, into Germany, and now into the Austrian Tyrol. Lee was the archetypal cigar-chewing, whiskey-drinking tank commander, called Captain Jack by his crew, and then a German officer drove up waving a white flag. Picture this moment. The war is over. Almost. 5 days since Hitler's suicide, 2 days before Germany's unconditional surrender, and a Wehrmacht major, the enemy, is asking for help. Without hesitation, Lee decided to help out. The march. They assembled a convoy, 3 Sherman tanks, 14 American soldiers, 10 German artillerymen, black infantrymen hanging onto the sides of the Shermans. At the lead of the column was Captain Jack Lee, commanding his beloved Sherman tank, Besotten Jenny. Right behind him was his close friend, Lieutenant Harry J. Bassey, commanding another Sherman tank nicknamed Boche Buster. They rolled out. Not long after leaving Kufstein, the relief force experienced a disastrous setback. Lee's column had to cross an old bridge over a tributary of the Inn River. 4 of the Sherman tanks made it across the rickety bridge, but as the 5th Sherman attempted to cross, the structure collapsed. Lee was forced to leave tanks behind. Then more at another bridge. By the time they reached Castle Itter, they had only 14 American soldiers, 10 German soldiers, and a single tank named Besotten Jenny. 6 kilometers from the castle, they defeated a party of SS troops that had been attempting to set up a roadblock. The castle appeared through the trees, and the French prisoners were not impressed. The disappointment. Paul Reynaud later wrote that Lee was crude in both looks and manners. 1 tank, 7 unwashed Americans, and Germans? The former prime ministers had expected an army. They got a carpenter from New York and 10 men who'd been trying to kill Frenchmen for 5 years. But they were all they had. Lee placed the men under his command in defensive positions around the castle and positioned his Sherman tank, Besotten Jenny, at the main entrance. And then something extraordinary happened. Lee had ordered the French prisoners to hide, but they remained outside and fought alongside the American and Wehrmacht soldiers. 70-year-old generals loaded rifles. Former prime ministers manned machine guns. According to Paul Reynaud, I soon saw that, as the tank was burning, the attackers could penetrate from the other side into the courtyard. I got my Tommy gun out of my trunk and went down to the courtyard where I found some soldiers. They shared a meal that night. An American captain, a German major, a former SS officer who'd defected, and the men who would rebuild France. They toasted, they planned, and they waited for dawn. May 5th, 1945, 4 a.m. The first shot shattered the silence like breaking glass. It came from somewhere in the darkness, a muzzle flash in the trees, a crack that echoed off the castle walls and rolled down the valley like thunder. And then the world exploded. Machine gun fire erupted from 3 positions simultaneously. Tracer rounds carved burning lines through the darkness, red and orange streaks that painted the mist with fire. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous roar that swallowed thought, swallowed breath, swallowed everything except the primal need to survive. The castle walls, built in the 13th century to withstand siege weapons and battering rams, began to shake. Bullets hammered the stone. Centuries-old mortar crumbled. Medieval windows that had witnessed plague and war and the march of history itself exploded inward in showers of glass and splinters. Inside the main building, a 70-year-old French general threw himself to the floor as rounds punched through the wall above his head. Dust and pulverized stone filled the air, turning his breath into painful gasps. The noise was beyond anything he'd experienced in the trenches of the First World War. This was concentrated, focused, personal. The SS wanted them dead. And then the 88 spoke. The sound of the 88mm anti-tank gun was different from everything else. Lower, deeper. A sound you felt in your chest cavity, in your bones. The muzzle blast lit up the hillside 800 yards away, a burst of orange fire that briefly illuminated the SS gunners in their black uniforms. The shell took 1.5 seconds to cross the distance. It struck the upper floor of the main building with a sound like the earth splitting open. The explosion was deafening. The entire structure shuddered. A fireball rolled out of the window where, just minutes before, Maurice Gamelin had been sleeping. Stone blocks, each weighing hundreds of pounds, shifted, moved. The medieval architecture groaned. Gamelin's room ceased to exist. If he'd been in it, they would have been scraping pieces of him off the walls. Outside in the courtyard, Captain Lee watched the explosion from his position in Besotten Jenny's turret. His face was lit by the flash. His eyes reflected the fire. "Shimczyk!" he shouted to his gunner. "Light them up!" Corporal Edward Shimczyk, that quiet kid from New York who'd joined the army to escape a future working in his father's butcher shop, traversed the turret with practiced precision. His hands moved over the controls with the kind of muscle memory that comes from 5 months of combat. 5 months of watching friends die. 5 months of becoming very, very good at killing. The Sherman's main gun bucked. The 76mm shell screamed downrange at 2,600 feet per second. In the village below, it struck a building that SS troops were using for cover. The explosion tore through wooden walls like they were paper. But the 88 fired again. This time, Lee saw it coming. Time does strange things in combat. Sometimes it compresses, sometimes it stretches. In that moment, watching the muzzle flash on the distant hillside, time became elastic. Lee could see the flash, could imagine the shell leaving the barrel, could picture its arc through the pre-dawn air, could do absolutely nothing to stop it. The first shell missed. It struck the ground 10 feet in front of Basat and Jenny and detonated. The explosion threw up a wall of dirt and stone. Shrapnel rattled against the Sherman's armor like hail on a tin roof. The concussion wave hit Lee in the chest, drove the air from his lungs. Simsek was already loading another round. His movements were mechanical, professional. His face showed nothing. Later, men who survived the battle would say that Simsek never stopped working, never showed fear, never hesitated. Not even when the second shell hit. Lee saw the impact point a fraction of a second before it happened. The shell punched through Basat and Jenny's side armor designed to stop rifle fire and machine gun rounds, but not purpose-built anti-tank weapons. The penetration was catastrophic. The shell didn't explode immediately. It entered the crew compartment traveling at supersonic speed. The kinetic energy alone was enough to kill. Metal fragments, pieces of the armor itself torn loose by the impact, became shrapnel. They ricocheted inside the tank at velocities that turned them into surgical instruments of death. Simsek was already moving. His combat instincts overrode thought. He threw himself toward the turret hatch. And then the shell's delayed fuse triggered. The explosion inside the tank was contained, focused. All that energy, enough to level a house, was trapped inside a steel box with nowhere to go except through flesh and bone and the thin aluminum fuel tanks. Fire erupted from every hatch. Orange flames shot 15 feet into the air. Black smoke boiled up to mix with the morning mist. The ammunition storage began to cook off. Smaller explosions inside the larger one, a staccato rhythm of death. Simsek came out of the turret hatch like a man shot from a cannon. His uniform was smoking, his face was burned, but he was alive. He hit the ground running and dove behind the castle gate just as Basat and Jenny's fuel tanks detonated. The Sherman, that tank that had carried Lee across France, across the Rhine, through Germany and into Austria, turned into an inferno. The paint blistered and peeled. The rubber tires melted. The metal itself began to glow dull red in places where the heat was most intense. The name painted on the hull, Basat and Jenny, bubbled and blackened and disappeared. Lee watched his tank die, and then he realized what it meant. They had no armor now, no mobile gun platform, no steel shield between them and 150 SS troops. They were naked. The destruction of Basat and Jenny signaled the start of the general assault. From the tree line, SS troops burst into the open. They moved in small groups, 3 and 4 men at a time, using fire and movement tactics that spoke of professional training. These weren't conscripts. These weren't old men and boys scraped from the bottom of the barrel in the war's final days. These were Waffen-SS. The 17th Panzer Grenadier Division, battle-tested, fanatical. Men who'd been fighting since France, who'd survived Normandy, who'd killed their own countrymen for showing white flags. They sprinted toward the castle's main gate, firing from the hip as they ran. On the battlements, the defenders opened fire. American GIs with Thompson submachine guns, Wehrmacht soldiers with MP-40, French politicians with rifles they barely knew how to use. Former French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud crouched behind a stone merlin, a defensive projection on the castle wall built to protect medieval archers, and squeezed off burst after burst from his Tommy gun. The weapon bucked against his shoulder. Shell casings ejected in bright brass arcs. He'd never fired a gun in anger in his life. Now, at 66 years old, He was fighting for his life alongside men young enough to be his grandsons. Below him, 70-year-old Michel Clemenceau loaded magazines with shaking hands. His fingers were arthritic. The magazines were German. The bullets were American. None of it made sense. All of it was necessary. The castle shook. Constant, relentless. The machine gun fire was so sustained that individual shots blended into a continuous roar. The medieval walls, designed to withstand arrows and catapults, began to come apart under modern weapons. Bricks loosened. Mortar turned to powder. A crenellation took a direct hit from something heavy and exploded, showering the courtyard with debris. A piece of stone struck Kurt Siegfried Schroeder's wife, the wife of the SS officer who'd defected to defend the castle, and opened a gash across her forehead. Blood streamed down her face. She didn't stop loading magazines. Hours passed like minutes. Minutes passed like hours. Time lost meaning. The sun was rising now. Pale light crept across the valley floor, turning the mist to gold, making the tracer rounds less visible but no less deadly. The beauty of the dawn, the Alps glowing pink and orange, the morning birds beginning to sing, created an obscene contrast with the violence. Men were dying in paradise. And then the phone rang. In the chaos, in the noise, in the hell of sustained combat, someone heard the telephone. Josef Gangl, the German major who'd defected, who'd driven under a white flag to ask his enemies for help, who'd spent the night positioning his men alongside Americans he'd been trying to kill just days before, grabbed the phone receiver. He shouted into it. Had to shout to be heard over the gunfire. He was calling Alois Meyer, the Austrian resistance leader in Vorgl, begging for reinforcements. Meyer's response was devastating. He could spare 2 men, 2 Wehrmacht soldiers, and a teenage boy, Hans Waltel, just 17 years old, barely old enough to shave. 3 more bodies against 150 SS. They arrived 20 minutes later, their truck racing up the mountain road under fire. Gangl positioned them immediately. Every rifle mattered now. Every trigger finger was precious. But it wasn't enough. By early afternoon, the defenders were down to their last ammunition. Lee was rationing magazines. Men were counting individual bullets. The radio was dead. The phone line had been cut. They were isolated, alone. And the SS sensed it. The attacks intensified. Squads of SS troops advanced closer, 50 yards from the gate, 40, 30. One more push and they'd be inside. And that's when a 46-year-old tennis player stepped forward. The run. Jean Borotra had won Wimbledon twice, had won the French championships, had played before kings and crowds of thousands. They'd called him the Bounding Basque for his energetic play, his attacks on the net, his refusal to give up. Now he stood before Captain Lee in a castle under siege and made an offer. "I can run," he said. His French accent was thick. His blue beret, the one he'd worn on tennis courts across Europe, sat on his head like a talisman. "I can reach the Americans. Tell them where the SS are positioned. Bring help." Lee looked at him, at this middle-aged man, this athlete past his prime, this politician who'd spent the war in a cell. "You'll never make it," Lee said. Borotra smiled. "I'm very fast." Lee told him what to say, drew him a map in the dirt, showed him where the 142nd Infantry should be. And then Borotra climbed the wall. The castle wall was 20 feet high, medieval stone, rough cut, with gaps between the blocks. Borotra found handholds, found footholds, climbed like he'd done this every day of his life. At the top, he looked back once, at Lee, at the burning Sherman, at the French prisoners and German soldiers and American GIs fighting together. And then he jumped. He landed in a crouch 20 feet below. The impact jarred his knees, 46-year-old knees that had carried him across thousands of tennis courts. But he was up immediately, and he ran. The SS saw him instantly, shouts in German, a dozen rifles swinging toward this lone figure sprinting across open ground. The first bullets kicked up dirt at his feet. Borotra juked left. The movement was instinctive, the same lateral quickness that had made him a champion. Bullets snapped past his head. He could hear them, could feel the displacement of air as they passed. He ran faster. His lungs burned. His legs screamed. But he'd spent 20 years training his body to exceed its limits, to push past pain, to find reserves when there were none. He reached the tree line and didn't slow down. SS troops were in there. He could hear them shouting, could hear them crashing through the undergrowth, trying to cut him off. Borotra ran like death itself was chasing him, because it was. He vaulted a fallen log, dodged through dense pine branches. His beret snagged on something and was torn from his head. He didn't stop, didn't look back. A burst of machine gun fire tore through the trees behind him. Bark exploded. Pine needles rained down. He ran. For 20 minutes he ran through enemy territory, through SS positions, through machine gun nests and sniper hides and groups of soldiers who couldn't believe what they were seeing. And he made it. He burst out of the tree line near the road and nearly ran headlong into an American patrol. A GI raised his rifle. "Don't shoot!" Borotra gasped. "Don't shoot! Castle Itter! They need help!" And there, by pure chance, was René Lévesque, a French-Canadian reporter embedded with the 142nd Infantry Regiment, a man who would later become Premier of Quebec, a man who recognized Jean Borotra on sight. "Mon Dieu," Lévesque whispered, "the tennis player!" Borotra delivered his message, drew maps, described the SS positions with the precision of a man who'd spent hours watching them, and then he asked for a uniform. "I'm going back," he said. They gave him an American Army uniform, gave him a rifle, and Jean Borotra, tennis champion, prisoner of war, hero, joined the relief column racing toward Castle Itter. Back at the castle, the defenders didn't know if he'd made it. They were down to perhaps 20 rounds per man. The SS were massing for a final assault. And then Josef Gangl saw something that stopped his heart. A window on the second floor. Paul Reynaud, the former Prime Minister of France, standing in it, silhouetted against the light, exposed. 800 yards away, an SS sniper saw it too. Gangl didn't think, didn't hesitate. He'd spent 5 years as a German soldier, 5 years following orders, 5 years fighting for a cause he'd come to despise, and in that moment, he chose. He threw himself toward Reynaud. The 7.92mm Mauser round crossed the distance in less than a second. It caught Gangl in the chest just as he reached the Frenchman. The impact spun him, dropped him. The round had punched through his lung, clipped his heart. He hit the floor and knew immediately it was fatal. Paul Reynaud knelt beside him. This French politician, this man whose country Gangl had invaded, whose people Gangl had occupied. "I'm sorry," Gangl whispered in German. Reynaud didn't understand the words, but he understood the sacrifice. He held the German major as he died. Josef Gangl, born September 12, 1910, in Bavaria, son of a railway official, survivor of Stalingrad and Normandy and Bastogne, died at 34 years old, saving the life of his former enemy. 2 days before the war ended. Outside, the SS were at the gate. They had a Panzerfaust, a German anti-tank weapon, aimed at the entrance. One shot would blow it open. One shot, and the castle would fall. The fuse was lit. And then, from down the mountain road, came the sound of engines. Heavy engines. American engines. The 142nd Infantry Regiment came around the bend at full speed. 3 Sherman tanks. 2 half-tracks packed with infantry. A company of men who'd pushed through the SS lines. Their 50 caliber machine guns opened fire. The SS squad at the gate, the ones with the Panzerfaust, were cut down before they could fire. The projectile fell from nerveless fingers. The reinforcements arrived like the cavalry in an old western, like divine intervention, like an answer to prayers no one thought would be heard. They tore into the SS positions with everything they had. It took 40 minutes to break the siege. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence was almost painful. 100 SS soldiers surrendered. The rest melted into the forest. Inside Castle Itter, American GIs found French politicians collapsed against the walls, gasping for breath, unable to believe they were still alive. They found German soldiers and American soldiers sitting together, too exhausted to move. They found Kurt Siegfried Schrader's wife, bleeding from a head wound, still clutching an ammunition belt. And they found Josef Gangl, lying on the floor of the second story, with Paul Renault still holding his hand. Every single French prisoner survived. The only defender who died was the German who'd saved them all. 2 days later, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe ended. But the echoes of Castle Itter remained. For his service defending the castle, Lee was promoted to captain and received the Distinguished Service Cross. He died in 1973. Gangl was honored as an Austrian national hero. A street in Vorgl was named after him. He was the sole defender to die during the battle, though 4 others were wounded. The French prisoners were evacuated to France that evening, reaching Paris on the 10th of May. They went on to shape modern France, to write constitutions, to rebuild a nation. If the SS had managed to get into the castle and kill all these French VIPs, the history of post-war France would have been radically different, said Stephen Harding, author of The Last Battle. But here's what haunts me about this story. It's not the battle itself, it's what the battle represents. For 5 years, Americans and Germans killed each other. Millions died. Cities burned. Entire peoples were exterminated. And then, for 1 day, in a castle in Austria, they fought together. Not because the war was over, not because they'd suddenly become allies, but because they'd found something more important than nations. They'd found humanity. Jack Lee didn't have to help Josef Gangl. Gangl didn't have to defect. Borotra didn't have to run. The French prisoners could have hidden in the basement, but they all made a choice. They chose to believe that even at the end of the world, even when everything was burning, there was still something worth protecting, worth dying for. Josef Gangl spent 5 years fighting for Germany. He served at Stalingrad, at Normandy, at Bastogne. And in the last 24 hours of his life, he died saving a Frenchman, a man whose country he'd invaded, whose people he'd occupied, whose capital he'd marched through. He died saving an enemy. Which means, in the end, he understood something that most soldiers never learn, that the uniform doesn't define the man, that enemies are just people on the other side of a line drawn by politicians, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is cross that line. The Battle of Castle Itter lasted 13 hours. 150 SS troops attacked. 36 defenders held them off. 1 man died. His name was Josef Gangl, and the street named after him in Vorgl still stands today, not as a monument to Germany, not as a monument to America, but as a monument to the idea that even in the darkest moments of human history, we have a choice. We can be soldiers, or we can be men. May 5th, 1945. The day enemies became allies. The day a German major died for a French prime minister. The day a tennis champion ran through machine gun fire. The day America and Germany fought side by side. It never happened again. But for 13 hours, in a castle in Austria, it showed us what we could be. If only we had the courage.